Everybody, welcome to the aftermath of TGSO 2025, the motion debrief for the preliminary rounds today. We'll do also another session for doing the out rounds tomorrow. This will not be the standard format. We'll probably only run through some amount of material for each round because we don't have enough amount of time to do everything very much in detail. So what I'll do is I'll try to have a bit of like a reading into what could have been expected for the motions per round and what could have been done better per round with terms of like argumentation and what kind of standard argumentation can you expect from each of these motions. We can also have discussions at any point of time. If you feel that you want to ask something particular to that particular round, you are more than welcome to drop a message on the chat so that we can discuss those questions. And you can also raise your hand so that I can give you permission to unmute at that point. So we'll go round by round and we'll start with round one first. Just for your convenience, I'm going to be reading out the motion for you and then we can sort of like have a discussion. If you want to follow through while reading the motions or have the motions in hand, please remember to just open the GSDC tab link. You will have a motions tab there where you will find all of the motions for all of the rounds displayed. So let's just begin with round one then. So round one had an info slide. The info slide read law firms traditionally operate by a partnership model where lawyers hold ownership and management positions. Lawyers themselves invest their own capital to fund the firm's operations. A private equity model would have a private equity firm own and manage a law firm. The motion for the round read, this house supports law firms moving to a private equity model. Couple of pieces of clarifications then before we go on and how to read the info slide properly. The first couple of pieces of evidence that you find from the info slide is that what is the current status quo which is operative in the world, which is that law firms traditionally operate in a model of partnership where people are generally co-owners or have some sort of like vested interest into the firm where there are say different positions, there are keystone partners, there are other places where people have some traditional roles and do things accordingly. So what happens here in say traditional law firm structures is that people who are like elevated to the position of a partner are given a stake within the say law firm and then are given this particular position to do their own like carry on their own activities and continue with their own like work in terms of how the work is handled in the firm by the layman's way of doing business in whatever sector they are in law, but also they're given some amount of like shares or ownership position in that in that partnership, which is simply means that if there are like 100 shares and 10 partners, you might have a distribution of 10 shares between each partners or whatever the partnership agreement might be. There's this like partnership doc which is there usually within partnership firms where there's an agreement about how the partnership is delineated, what are the roles of the partners, what are the necessities of the partners to do certain things for their role, what are their roles or responsibilities going to look like, so on and so forth. So what happens here is that traditionally in partnership models, if suppose I am there as one of the partners and there are other people who are also interested in taking part in this partnership, they invest their own money which they've earned over the period of time, maybe working for the firm, law firm that we're talking about, or elsewhere as well. They invest their own private like funds into these particular systems where then they get an ownership right into say these shares that this partnership firm holds. On the other end, in a private equity model, just to understand the info slide and the world a bit better, you basically have like X amount of shares where the X amount of shares delineate the ownership of the company. So the percentage of shares that you own, the more percentage of ownership that you have of the company and its decision-making systems, which simply means that when a private equity model is employed in a firm, that simply means that you will have the firm open its shares to everybody instead of like contributing towards their managerial positions or say having like self interest within or vested within say that particular firm in and of itself where they would have to work or have to take up positions and do things that are required within that partnership agreement. So in a private equity model, what gives way is that people from external sources can also invest very intrinsically into these systems, which means that you have like people who can go from outside and come around and invest money into these firms. So that being said, um, again, just reminding you if you have any doubts at any point of time, please drop a message or raise your hand. We will wait. I will wait and like take your question whenever we are having those doubts. So that being said, this motion has a very simple burden. On prop, you are going to then define the current status quo in where, sorry, the alternate status quo, where you're transitioning from say a partnership model to a private equity model, and on the opposition benches, you're supporting this idea about having the continuation of partnership models in the way in which it is operated traditionally for a long period of time. Now, simple, like quick framing, which you might expect from these things, is that what kind of like differences occur in terms of both paradigms. In Gov world, probably there is a much more probability for legal industry to brace innovation, technology, and do a lot more in terms of equating to modern business practices, because the current status quo when is like alienating a lot of other people from investing in law firms and only continuing the traditional source of continuing this partnership agreement and this partnership model. It begets that there are a lot of traditional things are then maintained in a law firm, and a lot of other new innovations and new ideas are not explored within the law firm spots. So it's much more likely that gov teams will frame this particular idea that private equity brings around more amount of economic investment. There might be like more amount of probability for innovation to happen because there's more quick accessibility towards funds. There's a lot more public scrutiny, and there's a lot more external like push coming around from people, so that there might be a lot more like changes happening in the law firm. In The reason why this is important is because this idea exists that in opposition world, when you're doing the partnership model, people are working within the similar ecosystem that they already exist within. So this idea that comes around, like this fresh idea or this fresh like perspective, is something which might be missing from say op world. Yes, Johan.
I just wanted to say the chat is disabled.
Right. I'm sorry, I'll
Yeah,
just enable it. No worries.
thank
It's
you.
enabled now. You can text there. Do you have a
Yeah.
question?
Yeah, not now because I have to go soon, but I was just wondering if a recording will be available.
Yeah, of course.
Great, thank you.
Okay, just continuing. Of course, please, if you have any like administrative questions, please drop it on the chat so that the flow is not interrupted if possible. Thank you. Anyways, innovation hubs might then become a major push coming from prop world. But this idea is that there might be like a lot more possibility for having R&D teams there. Now the question becomes that how do you justify R&D teams in law firms? This can be something which is simply the idea about say having AI innovation occurring in say these firms, because what happens in the model world, there's a lot more like conversation happening around AI innovation and how AI tools are being utilized in different sectors. There's also like this entire conversation which is happening around the world about having say inbuilt AI systems come around and work. There are also a lot of like AI legal systems that have been developed. So this can be a good approach or a strategic approach to have like sort of like a very good idea about why it is necessary to bring in private equity, because it brings around another level of expertise or specialized excellence which comes around beyond say law firms, because lawyers are not really tech experts or experts who have a lot of idea about AI innovation and other things that are associated with these ideas, right? So there's a lot more probability that these particular individuals will have exploration of different ideas which are much more like technically pronounced and in different fields like legal tech and other things can come around from this. So you can also discuss in framing what kind of like problems occur in terms of firms going beyond their jurisdictions, or what kind of efficiency issues occur within firms because people are very lackadaisical. There's no like probable regulation that is happening because you are sort of like managing yourself in a firm space, so it's not really something that is scrutinized very extensively by people who are on the outside, and there's not really a lot of oversight which is there. And there's also probability that there is much more like attraction of finances, because here what happens in a partnership model, there's a lot more probability that you need to work a long period of time for gaining the trust of other partners, which is usually what is happening in status quo, to get into the partnership model and get like accepted into the partnership. When that occurs, there's this entire conversation point which occurs that you might have a lot of other problems which are there, that you do not attract enough talent because talents might leave this particular organization when there's not enough amount of monetary compensation that is happening for these individuals or benefits that are accruing to these individuals. So these can be sort of like the benefits towards law firms, how you are like excelling better, you're probably getting better career progression in these firms because there's a lot more like potential scrutiny. The firms become probably more efficient because there's a large more competitive salaries which are possible to be paid for these individuals, because you're not like localizing all the benefits towards like a select group of individuals who are present in the partnership. And also there's a larger chance for like globalization of this firm, or say delocalization of the aspects of what this firm is operating within, while also like looking at specialized fields which might bring around innovation in these firms. For lawyers themselves, there might be a probability that there is a shift in focus from, say, managing the firm towards appointing specialized people or like having like a few people who are managing them, instead of having like different teams in the partnership model where each individual will be managing a particular section of these particular staffing sections, and then having sort of like discussions around the idea about how they are and what they're doing. So it gives people more ideas about specializing in certain roles for lawyers and also focusing on law, and gives a lot more like probable value propositions for these individuals. The other ideas that you can sort of like discuss within prop world is this talk about value and transparency. So again, the same conversation point occurs that if you are increasing more outside scrutiny and you're externalizing a lot more inputs and value systems, there's a lot of probability that there will be a lot more transparency and value driven assessment. And that might mean that a lot of people who are actually going to these law firms have more faith in how the law firm is operating, and they have a bit more transparency, so people have confidence in approaching these firms and how the costs or operations are run in these firms as well. So for example, if you're like an individual who's going to a law firm and is expecting some amount of legal service to be given to them, there's much more likelihood that there's price regulation and transparency in prices and understanding of how these prices are operating within that paradigm. So it might become something which is very important in terms of how it becomes predictable for individuals when they're going into these spaces, but you also like enhance the way in which these services are offered for the clients and other things which are there. The last probable thing that you can like thought of think about in terms of like this value addition question of how clients or the legal profession are benefiting from this in terms of your framing, this idea that there might be a probability of increased competitiveness, because then people are then required to then subscribe towards having some amount of like incentive driven models where they are going to get more like equity investments, or they're going to have like more sustainable investments and more sustainability in their systems when people are having like those increased competitiveness and multiple stakeholders are there in the market who are like making these things like competitive in the first place. So this increased competitiveness would mean that there's much more market access for people, and there might be much more like stability in pricing and benefit in pricing in terms of how it is operating. um so more or less, the arguments that you can raise then on understanding these particular ideas of framing is probably how the access to capital and investment occurs better in terms of this world. The second idea is probably around how professional management and business acumen increases for these firms, where people are then given the idea about how to do things much more efficiently, and management is left to like people who are probably able to manage this. Of course, on the contrary, there are certain argumentations that come around from op world here that there might be, say, certain ways in which people who are not specialized in understanding of legal acumen or legal models will be able to like then manage firms. I think, but however, this is an argument which I saw in a couple of rooms because I was judging this around, but it is still probable that you can negate this particular idea by simply defining your world a bit better by saying that what kind of positions or demarcations of these positions are occurring in these firms and who are actually taking up the administrative roles of administrative part of things, like for example salary management, payroll management, just like client sales and operations, and simple things like paying, staffing, and so on and so forth, and human resources and all of these things. These can be managed by people who are not from a law background. You're still having lawyers in the service end of things where people are like faced with providing this service to these individuals. So the law is still being done by the lawyers or in and of themselves. So it's not like really losing out on a lot of like professional management benefits that come around. And the harms can sort of be mitigated within that sense. So it's also beneficial for this business acumen to exist because A, there is much more like probability for increased efficiency of business systems. There's much more likelihood that there's much more specialized knowledge that these individuals operate within in terms of like how to do managerial work, how to do managerial tasks, how to do administrative tasks, and so on and so forth. So this can look at like long-term efficiency of these systems and how you can brand your firm and do like strategic thinking and strategic planning for how these firms are operating and how these firms are like perceived in the way in which they are in the market space. So that would probably be the idea in terms of how you're like assessing professional management and business acumen from the gov world. The third and fourth things are probably talking about these client benefits, which we were also defining when we were discussing aspects of how the world will look like in these fields, but also in terms of enhancements of service, which we were also mentioning that there's an increased transparency, there's a probability for like increased benefits which are occurring for these individuals because there's a price regulation which is coming around, and there's also like much more better awareness about people about how these particular law firms are operating and how these systems are operating. And also like general competitiveness benefits and so on and so forth. Now, that being said, that deals with mostly the matter that comes from the prop case. Of course, I'm not somebody who can like probably run down every possible idea which is there for the prop case, but in the gist of it, most of the central themes would lie around these four prongs that we discussed, as well as the framing that we discussed. So I'll just take like 5 to 6 seconds to pause here, just to see if there are any questions from anybody in the chat. You can speak, you can just raise your hand. I'll let you unmute and speak also if you have any questions. And I'll drink a bit of water meanwhile. None, none for Gov. Fair. So let's just discuss a bit about op as well then, in terms of how world building for op would be and how the argumentation for op would run. So the primary thing that I saw also raised within, say, arguments within the round, and I think this was something which was very like interesting as well as folks dealt with it, was this idea of how law firms become sort of like echo chambers of corporate houses, where they become legal mills where optimization and volume and capacity becomes prioritized, and it like takes away this idea about providing actual legal counsel and actual legal benefits towards these individuals, or approaching for a very specialized field and advisory commitments towards these individuals, which means that there are much more like interest in, say, maintaining a proper balance sheet and like profit and loss accounts. So quality might have been something which is compromised a lot in terms of how these particular systems are operating. The other idea that comes around from op world, which is very interesting to deal with, is this idea about how investment decisions are much more likely to be more short term. So there might be like, if for example a private equity individual is operating this particular system, and then part of the management structure and part of like the business administration structure, there's a farther likelihood that people are going to look at like return of investment and have a lot of like problems in, say, strategies that are occurring, because when people have like shareholding in firms, they want to make these shareholdings a much more likely to be like beneficial for them when they're in case deciding to sell it or maybe do something else down the line. So they're always going to prioritize short term like increase in turnover and increase in like short term benefits, instead of like long term pro bono relationships that occur within people, and also relationships that law firms are very intrinsically needed to do. Why is this an important consideration then? I think the first thing is to understand how the legal field operates. The idea of legal field is that it's a very subjective but also trust based thing. So when this particular field is very trust based and has like a lot of like things hinging upon reputation, and a lot of things hinging upon your relativity towards how this person is dealing with your case and how they are reputed in the field, how they're like dealing with clients, and how they're like being respected within the field for their work, and so on and so forth. In that sense, it becomes much more likely that if you're working towards making profit, you are much more likely to like forego this idea about social dynamics with these individuals, which means that there's a longer priority that you have in terms of only getting the most out of money, most things money wise out of this particular client, instead of trying to build like a lasting relationships. So why is this an important concern? So in legal fields, a lot of like things occur where people have recurring work coming from the same client. So these client and attorney relationships, or client and lawyer relationships, are very intrinsic. And it's also like a very a reputable thing that you need to do for your client to keep coming back to you. So, for example, if I take an example of like big five firms from, say, the UK or in, say, the Indian continent, a lot more trust is then held with firms which have a larger like respect within the world, which means that there's a lot more propensity for you to have meaning in building relationships with clients, and meaning in building like sustainable ways in which you're operating within systems, because that ecosystem becomes an echo chamber where a lot of conversations are happening between different clients, that right, this firm did this attorney did this, so it's much more likely that there will be good faith action by this attorney in the future, or maybe like they will be dealing with my case well in the future, so it is much more like likely that this firm is trusted, and this trust becomes a very important factor in the way in which firms scale and in the way in which firms attract new clients. So it becomes like a very important consideration as to how it is. This is on the contrary absent in the gov world, probably because of this idea that you might have to like do better for your balance sheet, or do better in terms of like getting your business sustainable and getting more amount of money out of this business as much as possible. So it becomes like a cyclic thing which you're currently continuously keeping on like doing as much as it is. So your actions become inhumane and also deprioritize legitimate interest of these particular individuals who have benefits associated with having social like norms associated with the legal field to be given to them. So that becomes a huge problem. The other thing is that probably when you are looking at cost cutting, a lot of support staff and a lot of like less probable figures in the legal field are taken away. However, they are very important like characters within the legal process. For example, a lot of clients like operate within the systems of having notaries, they have associates, they have like support staff, they have like attorney this sorry, I'm sorry, attorneys, they have scribes and so on and so forth. So all of these things like they have like a lot of issues when they're like exploring different cost cutting imperatives because these support staff are often like let go of. So there's a lot of like problems which are coming around in say giving enough amount of like justifiable workload balance towards say lawyers who are going to be then squeezed because of the lack of resources which are provided for imparting like good legal outcomes. So what is inherently mean is that quality of law practice differs a lot in say the op paradigm, sorry, in the gov paradigm as how the op would define it, simply because there's a lot of like loss of good faith and loss of like good amount of like support structures and narratives associated with like doing the practice of law and then having some amount of benefit. I see a question on the chat. So you say that as op, how do you prove that this trust and good faith factor is absent in private equity firms where they also have the incentive to do so to maintain their reputation? Right. So when you're discussing these particular points, right, these don't happen in like, I'm very, very rightly said, right, John? Because I think the first thing that the gov will come around and tell you is that, of course, private equity law firms will have like this guise about trying to maintain good faith and trying to do things, and probably will have still some amount of like PR burden which is associated with their firms. So they need to maintain their reputation, their clientele as well. So they will have to take steps which are there. However, I think when you're comparing both sides, which side is it more likely to occur to an extent where it is only acceptable towards where it is much more like qualitatively better off? So, in terms of that comparative, I think in Gov, you can easily say at the moment of time when you just will by the least amount of effort, getting the say sayers or say the good faith actions of these individuals sorted, you don't want to invest more money on that because simply because the bosses of these private equity firms aren't really that charitable by saying that, right, you can go into losses, don't show profits for these law firms. We don't mind. That's not going to happen at the end of the day. So the simple answer is that they have to do some amount of mechanization in terms of how they're justifying the investment they have for these like systems, which means that they will have some amount of like cutbacks which they have to do regardless of whatever like PR pushback might come around. So they'll try to make it as less like contradicting as possible for them in the sense that they will make it as less problematic as possible in the way that they're operating, but they'll still have some amount of like cost cutting and like pullbacks which will be there in terms of how they're operating these firms. So when this particular issue is existing, I think it is much more likely that on a comparative, you can discuss this idea that this is far less likely to occur in, say, op paradigm, because it's far more likely that this op paradigm does not just have the profit incentive, because partnership structures are made in a way in which they've already guaranteed some amount of like ownership towards the individuals. So the individual reputation is far more likely to be ruined instead of like the because the private equity law firms are also not the ones who have the name on the like hoarding, right? It's the name of the law firm which is on the hoarding. So it's much more likely that the loss of reputation does not have like any like pushback mechanisms into say private equity firms. So it's much less likely that private equity firms cannot like sell their stake and like completely rescind their actions and just like leave the firm, leave the law firm altogether just to say that they're making a loss or they're making like bad faith actions. So at that point of time, the law firm then becomes much more like ominously problematic here because then you do not really have any like justifiable like checks and balances which are there. Ria mentions that there was an argument by CEO that there is a higher chance of monopolization by a few companies in the gov world. How to rebut that? I mean, it's not like a good faith call to make that particular claim because I think a lot of like big law firms are sort of invested by say like private equity firms. Let's take a like example of the consultancy sector. Like McKinsey is there, Boston Consulting Group is there. There are KPMG is there, Accenture is there, Deloitte is there. There are so many firms which are there, right? In this case, also there were like a lot of like investments from private equity firms. There are Blackstones, there are Keystone and Partners, there are lots of firms in a lot of different places. So there's a larger chance that the monopolization is far less likely to occur because private equity firms don't really want to self-compete with themselves. So it's much more unlikely that since multiple law firms practice in similar practice areas, it's very little like benefit that there will be like like any sort of like investment from multiple like the same equity firm into multiple law firms with the same practice areas because A, it's unfeasible. B, I will give you the idea that there is a lot more like correction mechanisms because I think antitrust regulations still apply. They are not absent in this particular structure. So monopolization is not going to be like completely like accepted within, say, antitrust regulations in most democratic states or in whatever like Western world or East or say the global south that you're trying to discuss this motion from. So I think those are the couple of responses that you can have in case there are like ideas about monopolization which is coming around. So you can sort of like run that parallel thought as well in terms of how they are. Feel free to keep dropping your questions in the chat. I'll keep taking them whenever you put them in there. The other couple of things from Op, then there's this idea about homogenization of service. So I think there is also a problem where you see that a lot of law firms have unique cultures. These unique cultures stem that they are very good at certain fields, probably not so much in all fields, right? Because law has a lot of like subsets. There might be international law, there might be corporate law, there might be human rights, there might be other things. There are like hundreds and hundreds of things which can be niche areas within your law firm specializations. Since firms have developed over a large period of time, these specializations have become very robust, but also very niche. Some niches don't really service a lot of like clients, but still have like some amount of promising revenue, which means that there are few firms that are operating within that. What this means is, for example, there's a sector like called maritime law, which means that you're like talking about how ships operate in the open seas and what kind of like documentation, contracts, and other things are needed for doing this. So this problem occurs when people are like, if they're focusing on financial metrics, their quality of service becomes completely faulty. And this difference of service, which is required from, say, discussing maritime law to say international law to say human rights, is also completely lost in this particular translation in this fact. So I think that is also something that you can probably run. And also there's also like a lot of arguments which are going to be beneficial in terms of how the lawyers themselves are operating. Like, for example, you lose out the professionalism of this particular field. So since like lawyers are considered professionals in the standards like chartered accountants and so on and so forth, it's likely that these private equity investments might mean that there is a lot less professionalism in the field because the autonomy of these individuals are severely contained within, say, ideas about how these systems operate. So that becomes a huge problem. I'm coming to your question in a second, Shragvi, just like completing the discussion about what kind of other arguments you can run. There are also possibilities of ethical compromises that are coming around from lawyers. There's also like a challenge in terms of how lawyers' quality of life is reduced and things operate. The other thing is, on a contrary towards how we were dealing with the issue of clients in the corp world, law is subjective. You can't like have an objective application of law in different criterion. Not all clients will have the same problem. Their factual problems are different. The background is different. The interpretation of the law related to that background is different. So you can't really commodify the service, and that becomes like a lot of problem. And there's a lot of like redundant probabilities that customers become more vulnerable towards how the profession is operating, and there might be a lot of like headaches which occur from them and so on. So you can have those conversations about erosion of independence, erosion of professional ethics and substances, but also how clients are put at a disadvantage because they're not really sure about getting the right amount of like calls because the lawyers are trying to like commodify their service as much as possible, and this quality might be like severely like lacking, and then the absence of accountability and transparency also becomes an issue. The other thing is that this entire, I think the major like other problem that comes from the op world is this idea about um, lawyer and client confidentiality. That becomes a very negative factor because you don't really know how your data is being managed, how your issues are being solved, and if this is safe under the guise of a private equity firm. It's a bit of a push, but it's still there as an idea or theme that you can explore probably. That more or less deals with the op paradigm. I'll just take the couple of questions that are remaining in the chat, and I'll wait for a couple more minutes before we start the second mission. Um, right. Shagvi mentions certain ideas like political influence permeating in private equity firms at a greater scale. That's somewhat of an argument that would be bought. Define permeation, because I think the problem here is it's probably there on both sides. It's much more likely that you get callouts on both sides for the same. So there's not really any differentiating factor as to whether the callout will exist or not, or whether this problem will actually be addressed or not. So you don't really know at what framing this would operate. Because for me to answer this question very succinctly, you have to have good framing in Gov to run this idea, but you have to also have a lot of good counter framing in Op to like negate this idea. So you have to be a bit careful in which in the way in which you're framing that. The way in which you discuss this is sort of like, if political influence exists, there's a larger scale that law is sort of not done. But then this idea is that lawyers follow the letter of the law, sometimes the spirit of the law, and judges also like mostly apply the letter of the law, then the spirit of the law, in case there are questions about the letter of the law. This simply means that there are sometimes very strict interpretation versus very like loose interpretation when there are things which are not really delineated, which is where I was also talking about the subjective nature of each case, where factual backgrounds are very different and issues might occur there, so on and so forth. So you have to be very careful about how scaled up these issues become. Um, you have another question like vested interests of investors, corporations, class action lawsuits. Very true. I think those things occur problematically in both sides. Because, for example, if the private equity firm is doing abuse and doing something which is very problematic, you don't really have any checks and balances you're associated with those particular things, because who do you then you just go to another law firm and you have to like call out these things. And that becomes a he said, they said, we all said sort of like situation, and becomes really messy. In the debate also, if you're like going into like this application of practicality and say thinking about how practicality might not work for these particular political systems operating within the guise of like influencing the private firm or the law firm, I think that becomes a really messy debate. So on this debate strategy, it might be something that would probably need a bit of a backseat instead of like a complete like upheaval and like discussion up front. Any other question for motion one before we go on to motion two? None? Okay. Perfect, no worries. Motion 2 also has an info slide and also has um, a bit of like framing that you need to remember in terms of how the info slide operates. You have questions, please raise your hand. I know you can't unmute. If you raise your hand, I'll let you unmute. Don't worry, I'm letting you unmute now. Go on.
Yeah, I think I have questions on like two ideas of framings that Gov has run. There's something that we ran in our room. First was the idea of an alternative incentive of private equity firms, specifically them instead of wanting to sell this company for parts later down the line, which probably becomes the most intuitive op case. We push for an idea that it probably wants a long-term connection with this company that exists, so it can directly have like like a legal actor which it can use for the multiple cases that they probably are exposed to within the because of the nature of their occupation. Is that a fair model to run? And if yes, then what is something that op can do to counter it?
I think the first thing that op questions here is how regulatory bodies would sort of operate within this paradigm, because they will, of course, not like take it very lightly that private equity firms are taking advantage of the law firms of taking these issues for themselves. But I think the more likely probability is that what is the goal or incentive of private equity firms? The goal of private equity firms are to generate the most amount of income from their investments to satisfy people who are actually invested into the firm, who's actually providing the funds into the firm, so these
Yeah.
firms can invest back in, right? When you address this particular question in terms of MEC, then it becomes this idea that is it better in your paradigm when private equity firms are holding things for a long term because market uncertainties exist? Or is it better that they try
Hmm.
to gain some amount of like quick term gains, which would ensure that this financial position of the law firm is at the position which they can justify selling off the stock so that they can also give some amount of return back into investors
Hmm. Okay.
and
Yeah.
repeat the process altogether? So this contravening paradigms exist on both
Hmm.
sides. So you have to be very careful in framing this idea, because otherwise it becomes very problematic for addressing
for
the.
the ads to ever, okay, it becomes a wash. A secondary idea on this is something where you try to pull off on a larger scale utility. What we try to say, in larger law firms, there's still an highly competitive incentive, there's still extreme amounts of efficiency because they have grown to a certain extent that the efficiency that comes from equity models exists in these paradigms. Even if you believe there are incentives to grow this company, to like sell this company for scrap, you probably have to grow at this company, which means you probably invest in like a smaller or like a middle area law firms end up, and that becomes the highest amount of connection with private equity models. For them to even sell this for parts on scale, they will have to grow this company, which means even if they're trying to pull for maximum efficiency, just based on the amount of growth that they have to do extreme amounts of not extreme, but like a large scale amounts of employment and additional idea of facilities as compared of like cutting down parts, because cutting down parts happens when you're trying to efficiently manage a thing. Maybe this growth is not as fast, but this growth is necessary because you can only sell a company in a better way if you are able to grow
Couple of responses I think come around. Firstly, it's not true that small to medium firms are good. There is a reason why there are they are like small to medium firms in certain niches, because in the law sector, some niches have a lot of revenue potential, some niches don't have a lot of revenue potential. So we can't fairly address this in a debate space, because that would mean that you're just factualizing things in the debate and it would become very messy. So we don't
it.
really know where it would be prioritized this investment. Let's just say that there will be a possibility that there is like investment in, say, small, medium, and large firms. And let's just look at the perspective from all three of them. One, when we're looking at the idea about how investment occurs so that they're much more sellable, there are two ways probably. One in which we say that there's probability that you have a more robust firm built, because when you're investing into this firm, you provide it with certain capital, which means that they can go on to hire and make their systems better, make their like clientele bigger. But there's only so much of the pie that you can cut, right? And
Hmm.
take a share of. So like explaining that on a comparative becomes hard, but that's still a mech that we can sort of like understand for your like model. But the second idea becomes this cost cutting efficiency model, where you're probably going to like try to bring in systems which would take less time
Hmm.
but give more output, and this output can sort of pass the quality screening, which would likely look like something which is beneficial towards the client also, but
Yeah.
then also less costly towards the firm. What this could mean is, as I was explaining the prop case, this might look like, say, things like AI and legal tech coming into like the picture, people having like investments into the firm, probably going into like sectors like law with AI, and that might be augmenting law firm systems, which might mean that a lot of support staff and other people are fired, which means that more efficiency is gained within the system of itself.
Hmm.
Of course, a human can't like research as quick as like an AI or a bot can. So it's much more likely that paralegals and other people are like losing jobs and things anyways. So is it desirable then for this particular institution to do this for the way in which they are gaining returns for it? Definitely, because I think it's much more like quick returns for short investment, instead of having like constant amount of payments going out to a larger staffing, which means that there's more and more like resource burden down
Hmm.
the line,
Fair enough.
because people will get promoted, people will get bonuses, people will get increments. So your like quantum of output going out towards like paying staff and all will still be there. So
Yeah.
the amount of like profit margins you can maintain is harder to justify. So you have to always be like careful in approaching that idea. Of course, people don't go that deep into analyzing it this well. Since we are like speaking way beyond like 7 minutes, I can explore this theme as deeply as I can. So strategically, if you frame it in a way in which people might have to take too much time to like respond, fair, you can run that idea, not a problem. But just be
Mhm.
careful that there are certain pitfalls that you're running when you're running that argument.
Fair enough. Thank you so much.
No worries. Any other question for motion one? Sorry, round one. There is only one motion for rounds. Right. I know I wanted to discuss all of the preliminary motions today, but I don't think it will be probable. We are meeting again tomorrow at 10. We'll probably meet again if need be on Saturday or Monday, whenever the time permits. But I will do all the motions. If not in these live sessions, then at least a recorded um, video would go out on the channel at some point of time. Recordings have been done. You will find them at the Debate Central on YouTube, and I will share them in the group as well shortly.